This exhibit is based on the idea that what Henry James called the visitable past is worth visiting. The particular way in which this exhibit visits the past is by presenting items that may properly be called relics, which in its general sense simply means things left behind. The letters, draft poem, printer's proof, and inscribed first editions in this exhibit were left behind by the poet William Butler Yeats, who was born in Dublin in 1865 and died in 1939. Things left behind by a great poet are worth preserving and studying because they tell us something about the poetry. And Yeats certainly was a great poet. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1923. Not long after his death, T.S. Eliot observed that Yeats was one of those few whose history is the history of their own time, who are part of the consciousness of an age which cannot be understood without them. In the years since, his reputation has not diminished. As the great Seamus Heaney said, Yeats's greatness as a writer has grown indisputable. In exploring Yeats's greatness as a poet, we are guided by his invitation to look at his life as a guide to his poems. A lyric poem, he said, is no rootless flower, but the speech of a man. Yeats believed that the speech of his poetry was inspired. By that he meant it derived from an influx of knowledge or power from outside the world of normal experience. As he often did when hedging his convictions against a skeptical audience, he put this belief in the form of a question. When a man writes any work of genius or invents some creative action, he asked, is it not because some knowledge or power has come into his mind from beyond his mind? And so, believing in inspiration and endlessly fascinated by women, Yeats was predisposed to be attracted to the Greek notion that poetry is inspired by the muses, daughters of the powerful Zeus, and Mnemosyne, goddess of memory. Yeats was particularly drawn to the idea that the muse could reside in a living woman, who, like Petrarch's Laura, would inspire by drawing out sweet words from her admiring suitor. This exhibit brings some of Yeats's past into the present by displaying relics of his relationships with 5 fascinating women who inspired some of his most memorable poems. The exhibit contains fascinating items relating to Maud Gonne, who was the subject of some of Yeats's most quoted and best known poems. She was, as Yeats put it, a beautiful woman who had, he said, left the society of the viceregal court for Dublin nationalism. She was a militant organizer of opposition to English rule in Ireland and a fiery orator. Pallas Athena in that straight back and arrogant head, Yeats said about her in his poem, Beautiful, Lofty Things. Yeats met Gonne when she called on the Yeats family home in 1889 at the suggestion of the Fenian leader, John O'Leary. Yeats remembered that visit as he said, the moment when the troubling of my life began. He immediately set to writing poems about Gonne, and he wrote them in the courtly love tradition, the old high way of love, as he called it. The courtly love poet writes poems in praise of the beloved, even though he knows she is unattainable. In fact, because she is unattainable. Gonne was for Yeats, as he said Beatrice was for Dante, the apple on the bough most out of reach. Like Dante, Yeats sought inspiration by praising the unreachable apple. He wrote poem after poem to her about Gonne, from their first meeting through the last of his many rejected proposals of marriage in 1917, and in fact he continued to write of her and about her and to her until his death in 1939. Yeats's poems about Maud Gonne or to her are the most sustained tribute to a muse in the history of literature in English. Now, because the courtly lover's poet has an urge to achieve his muse by writing poems in praise of her, to win her is to lose her. And thus, in the poems Yeats writes about Maud Gonne, they're often more of despair than of celebration. Although he may celebrate her as a figure, he describes his own dispute often in terms of despair. In one of the beautiful volumes in the exhibit, In the Seven Woods, There is a quotation from one of the poems that Yeats writes on the title page of the volume, and it too is a lament rather than a celebration. He writes, "The boughs have withered because I have told them my dreams." One of the most compelling items in the exhibit takes us right into the core of a poem's creation. This is the draft of a poem entitled "The Folly of Being Comforted," and it reflects an interesting twist on the Dantean tradition of poetry in praise of the muse. The poem tells how Yeats's great friend Lady Gregory tried to comfort him for his inability to capture Gunn's heart by telling him that since Gunn was growing older, time can make it easier to be wise. And as the poem says, all that you need is patience. But no, says Yeats, he cries out toward the end of the poem, if she'd but turn her head, you'd know the folly of being comforted. The draft shows Yeats making a change in order to adhere more closely to the praise tradition. In the draft, Gregory's comment is that your well-beloved's hair has threads of gray and there are crow's feet about her eyes. And in the draft, we can see Yeats crossing out the crow's feet and substituting little shadows come about her eyes. In other words, he stays true to the praise tradition. And in fact, in the text of the poem, as we see it in the draft and as printed, he goes it one better by insisting that time can make her beauty over again. Yeats's deeply moving poem, Words, which is shown in the exhibit under its original title, The Constellation, meditates on his understanding that the turmoil engendered by his muse ignites the flame of inspiration, and that, were it not for the turmoil engendered by her unattainability, there might have been no poetry. As he says in The Constellation, what might have shaken from the sieve, I might have thrown poor words away and been content to live. The exhibit contains some quite touching and very interesting and informative items relating to Olivia Shakespeare. She was a different kind of muse from Maud Gunn, but a very powerful presence in Yeats's psyche. She was a beautiful and accomplished novelist whom Yeats met at a dinner for the 1890s journal, The Yellow Book. In about 1896, in fact, exactly in 1896, roughly 5 years after Yeats had begun his unsuccessful pursuit of Maud Gunn, Olivia Shakespeare introduced him to the real experience of sexual union that had fascinated him and continued to fascinate him so much as metaphor. In the period just before and just after they began their sexual relationship, Yeats wrote some poems to Olivia Shakespeare that address her anonymously as white woman and associate her with the muse-like creative principle figured in the moon throughout the archaic world and celebrated in modern times by Robert Graves as the white goddess. The poet worshiper of the white goddess praises her earthly incarnation, who is his muse. Yeats's poems to Shakespeare in this tradition are contained in his first great collection, The Wind Among the Reeds, in 1899. The exhibit contains a copy of that volume with the distinctive and beautiful cover by Althea Giles, who captured the essence of the title in her evocative interwoven reeds on the cover of the book. One of the poems in The Wind Among the Reeds, He Remembers Forgotten Beauty, suggests that when the poet hears white beauty sighing too in the sighs of his lover, he is hearing the loveliness of the white goddess that has long faded from the world. However, Shakespeare did not conform to the rubric of the muse as unattainable, and Yeats returned to his fruitless pursuit of the unattainable Maud Gunn. Nonetheless, Shakespeare remained a dear and deeply valued friend. In 1926, nearly 30 years after they first became lovers, Yeats wrote Shakespeare that he had been looking at her photograph from that era with, as he said, a profile like that on a Sicilian coin. It made him feel, he said, like an old man dying of thirst who in his youth had turned away the cup half tasted. Not long afterward, he wrote his beautiful encomium to love as friendship, entitled After Long Silence. Speech after long silence, it is right, all other lovers being estranged or dead. Unfriendly lamplight hid under its shade, the curtains drawn upon unfriendly night, that we descant and yet again descant upon the supreme theme of art and song. Bodily decrepitude is wisdom. Young, we loved each other and were ignorant. The friendship continued until Shakespeare's death just a few months before Yeats's own. The exhibit contains a copy of a text of Yeats's October 1936 BBC broadcast on modern poetry, bearing Yeats's inscription to Olivia from her oldest friend, WBY. That inscription, in terms of their long friendship, confirms, I think, that Shakespeare was the woman praised in the poem Friends, when there's praise of a woman who, because no thought, nor those unpassing cares, no, not in these 15 many times troubled years, could ever come between mind and delighted mind. Florence Farr is also featured in the exhibit with some quite interesting material. And Farr was a really multifaceted kind of a muse who enchanted and attracted Yeats in many different ways. 15 months after his fateful meeting with Maud Gonne, and about 4 years before he would meet Olivia Shakespeare, Yeats went to see Todd Hunter's play, A Sicilian Idyll, in which Florence Farr Emery played a devotee of the Greek moon goddess Selene. Yeats analogized her beauty to that of Demeter, one of the names of the white goddess. She had 3 great gifts, he wrote: a tranquil beauty like that of Demeter's image near the British Museum reading room door, and an incomparable sense of rhythm and beautiful voice, the seeming natural expression of the image. This almost magical blending of characteristics made Farr an overwhelmingly inspirational figure. Yeats thought that her chanting of his poetry to a stringed instrument called a psaltery enabled the listener to experience poetry as enchantment, as he thought the Greeks had done. He was so captivated by this experience that he wrote, "If I were a wise man and could persuade a few people to learn the art, I would never open a book of verses again." Although Farr and Yeats were briefly lovers, she forfeited status as a muse by refusing to assume the role of an unattainable source of wisdom. Rather, as Yeats told her in a moving letter, she enabled him to be his own self. And to be this, he said, not because one has created some absurd delusion that all is wisdom. The way in which Farr's complexity unsettled Yeats is reflected in the exhibit and a printer's proof with Yeats's markings of his poem Against Witchcraft, which suggests that the muse can also be a witch. He wrote Farr that this poem was suggested in some vague way by a letter from her. Still, the two were kindred spirits. The exhibit contains a fascinating letter that Yeats wrote to Farr after she had moved to Ceylon in 1912. In it, he recalls their years of work together and says that her letters about native music in relation to speech and to poetry have probably found what we have all been looking for. Farr reclaimed her status as a muse after her death in 1917. A poem that she wrote on her deathbed and sent from there to Yeats gave birth to the poem All Souls' Night, a magnificent poem about the ability of the dead to inspire the living poet. Following the suggestion in Farr's letter that the living can commune with the dead by invoking their spirits, the poem, using her married name, intones "On Florence Emery I call the next," and then goes on to tell how in Ceylon she had raveled out, he says, the mystery of the soul's journey. How it is whirled about until it plunged into the sun, and there, free and yet fast, being both chance and choice, forget its broken toys and sink into its own delight at last. Iseult Gunn is another very interesting muse, possibly thought of as the pupil as muse. In the wake of the Easter 1916 Rising, Yeats spent much of the summer in Normandy with Maud Gonne and her 22-year-old daughter, Iseult. Walking on the beach with Iseult, he wrestled with the idea that she might succeed her mother as muse. Their conversations inform Yeats's intriguing little book about a muse's power to inspire, entitled Paramica Silentia Lunae. The exhibit contains a copy of the book with its beautiful cover, designed, as many of Yeats's covers were, by Thomas Sturge Moore. The dedication of the book to Iseult, under her childhood name Maurice, states that the book recounts all that I said or would have said in those conversations the two shared as they walked the beach at her mother's home in Calvados in the summer of 1916. The exhibit also features the classic volume The Wild Swans at Coole, which contains a number of poems inspired by Assault. One of them, a song, echoes the earlier poem The Words, which we looked at in connection with Maud Gunn, and which was written, of course, to Assault's mother, Maud. Like Words, this poem emphasizes the importance of Yeats's experience as a lover to his poetry. His words are his mode of sexual expression. Here, he laments that, though I have many words, what woman's satisfied? His sad insight at the end of the poem is, I thought no more was needed, youth to prolong, than dumbbell and foil to keep the body young. Oh, who could have foretold that the heart grows old? Yeats's proposal to Maud in the summer of 1917 was quickly rejected, and he followed up with a proposal to Assault. Assault declined, but seemed unwilling to give up her muse status completely. The prospect of a second generation of pursuing an unattainable muse was a terrible emotional burden on Yeats and an uncanny and unnerving experience. And what he called a kind of emotional suicide, the 52-year-old poet proposed marriage to 26-year-old George Hyde Lees, a fellow student of occult subjects to whom Olivia Shakespeare had introduced him. George, as Yeats called her, became herself a powerful muse, something like a combination between a Sibyl and a muse. Yeats and George were married the following October of 1917. On their honeymoon in Ashdown Forest, Yeats was immediately plunged into a great gloom. Those were the words he used in a letter to Lady Gregory, telling her that he felt that by his marriage he had betrayed 3 women. The union was saved by what Yeats told Gregory was something very like a miraculous intervention. George at first feigned receipt of a consolatory message through automatic handwriting, something that she knew Yeats had great confidence in. Suddenly, she maintained, a superior force took over, guiding her hand to write words from beyond her mind. Fascinated, Yeats pressed her into 5 years of intensive communication with the unknown spirits, who told Yeats, through George's automatic writing, that they had come to give him metaphors for poetry. This amazing tale is told in a volume contained in the exhibit, A Packet for Ezra Pound. The book is open to the title page with the candle and waves device by Sturge Moore. Yeats sent this volume to Pound, who had been best man at his wedding. His letter to Pound forwarding the book reflects his great hopes for the forthcoming book that will be based on the automatic writing. He told Pound that the packet would be the introduction to a book which, when finished, will proclaim a new divinity. Yeats celebrated George's great gifts in the poem The Gift of Harun al-Rashid, in which he says that she could shake more blossom from autumnal chill than all my bursting springtime knew. So overwhelmed was Yeats by this gift that his memorable volume, The Tower, shown in the exhibit with the iconic Sturge Moore cover, poses a question that shows George rivaling even the legendary Maud Gunn as muse. The haunting question asks, does the imagination dwell the most upon a woman won or woman lost? The answer to that question can be found in the poems, which, as Yeats says in The Tower, are fashioned of memories of love, memories of the words of women. And because the words in the poems are no rootless flowers, our understanding and enjoyment is enhanced by this exhibit's collection of relics from the visitable past of Yeats's muses. The visit, I think, validates Yeats's assertion that works of lyric genius, when the circumstances of their origin is known, gain a second beauty, passing, as it were, out of literature and becoming life.